Well, fighting the global environmental impacts of climate change unfortunately requires local impacts from mining. And the minerals which are mined, they're needed for electric vehicles, wind turbines and power grids. Well, the White House aims to increase U.S. production of these critical minerals that China and other countries with weaker environmental standards have come to dominate. But local opposition is complicating the effort. VOA's Steve Baragona looks at the battle over one such mine in the northern U.S. state of Minnesota. Take a look.
Tamarack, Minnesota, 700 kilometers northwest of Chicago. Just outside this tiny town, mining company Talon Metals has found rich deposits of nickel, says Chief Geologist Brian Goldner.
This is one of the most high-grade samples, or it is the highest grade sample I've ever held in my career.
These high-grade nickel deposits could help with the shift away from fossil fuels. Nickel is a key component in electric vehicle batteries, and EV sales are climbing. But the United States does not produce enough to meet its needs, Goldner says.
In the United States, nickel deposits are quite rare. The only active high-grade nickel mine is Eagle in Michigan. Tamarack would be the second, and there isn't really anything else kind of on the radar.
But in what's called the land of 10,000 lakes, there are worries about what a nickel mine might do to the environment. In late summer, nearby lakes are covered with wild rice. It's sacred to the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe Native Americans, says the tribe's Natural Resources Director, Kelly Applegate.
It's part of our cultural identity. It's the reason why we are here. A prophecy told us to migrate to where the food grows upon the waters.
But wild rice could be at risk if a common mining problem happens. When the nickel sulfide in the rocks mixes with air and water, it makes sulfuric acid. Acid mine drainage leaves thousands of kilometers of American streams rusty orange and lifeless.
The track record for nickel mining is not good globally. There's a lot of risk involved with pollution.
It's unfortunate that there's the bad track record, but this is not your grandfather's mine anymore, is what we like to say. Modern mining is completely different.
Jessica Johnson heads community relations for Talon Metals. She says the company heard local people's concerns.
The key concern we heard from the community is that they didn't want to see tailings and processing of nickel in a wet environment like here in Minnesota.
So the company plans to use a nearby rail line to send the ore to North Dakota for processing. But the Mille Lacs Band is not convinced, Applegate says.
We've only been provided information and been told that the mine is going to operate differently or safely. But we don't want to be part of that grand experiment. We really want to see the data that proves it first.
Two other proposed nickel and copper mines in Minnesota have hit roadblocks recently over environmental concerns. Meanwhile, global demand keeps growing, Johnson says.
These minerals need to come from somewhere, and I think this is a great location to do it because it's right in my backyard where we can keep an eye on things, make sure it's done safely and responsibly.
Meanwhile, Talon keeps finding more nickel in Tamarack as regulators consider whether the company can mine it safely. Steve Baragona, VOA News.
Well, until it can mine its own critical minerals domestically, the U.S. is acquiring access to them through building alliances and partnerships with nations that are rich in these resources. VOA's Jessica Stone spoke to Greg Poling of the Washington, D.C. think tank CSIS. He's a researcher and fellow with the Southeast Asia Program, a region plentiful in rare earth minerals. Take a listen.
I want to begin, Greg, by asking you, how rich is Southeast Asia in these critical minerals?
Indonesia is the largest nickel source in the world. The Philippines probably has the second most nickel in the world. Vietnam reportedly has the second most amount of critical minerals, or rare earth elements rather, in the world. So wherever you look in the region, you find something that somebody wants and that they want pretty badly.
What would you say the prospects of having a critical minerals free trade agreement with Indonesia are?
It does seem possible, but I think it's going to be a longer road than people expect. When President Jokowi was in Washington last week, they pushed for this again, and the U.S. administration agreed to set up a process, a dialogue. But members of both parties on the Hill have been clear that any future agreement with Indonesia or other major mineral suppliers has to involve a lot of progress on labor and environmental standards, and may have to involve some kind of separation of the supply chain to make sure that Chinese companies working in those countries can't find backdoors to sell and qualify for IRA subsidies.
One thing I wanted to ask you about is even though we know that more countries than China actually have these deposits of critical minerals, we also know that China still dominates the processing space. And I wonder how you see Southeast Asian nations in particular trying to take advantage of the need to diversify that aspect of the supply chain for U.S. companies.
I think there's a lot of hunger in much of Southeast Asia to get a bigger piece of the processing pie, because that's where the real money's at. And so you saw Indonesia over the last few years basically force companies, Chinese companies, Korean companies, and American companies, if you want Indonesian nickel, you've got to process more of it in Indonesia. You can't just take the raw ore, ship it to China, and then do all the value add. So there is effort to break that Chinese grip on much of this processing. The problem with processing is it's dirty. That's why it doesn't happen in what we consider the global north. That's why you don't see major production in the US. It's not like the US doesn't have minerals. It's because no neighborhood wants to have a smelter in their community. Even in Southeast Asia, if you look at rare earth elements, for instance, the only place that you really see rare earths processed outside of China is a single factory in Malaysia, which the Malaysian government has tried to shut down for years because it's so dirty and so unpopular.
In terms of Indonesia's ability to meet the kind of standards that the U.S. would like them to when it comes to labor and environment, how far is the gap?
It is wide. There is speaking to a larger problem here with the administration's trade policy and economic policy. There's a reason that Pillar 1, the trade part of IPEF, fell apart. It's because the Congress and the administration will not agree to a deal that doesn't have high labor standards and high environmental standards. But labor, I think, is a bigger problem. That is costly and difficult for partner nations. And we're not offering anything to get them to do it, right? If you're not going to offer market access, then why should a partner country make these concessions? The administration doesn't have an answer. And after a year and a half of IPEF talks, they couldn't find an answer.
All right, Greg Poling, thanks so much for your expertise, and we will see you again another time.
Thank you.